Isaiah, he starts this prophecy talking about a new king who's going to rule with justice and righteousness. And he's talking about, in this prophecy, about what this new king will bring with him. And I'm literally just going to walk through the passage as we go, and we can look at what we can expect and experience with the coming of this new king, who we know now in our context is King Jesus, the light of the world. I'm not going to read through the whole passage. We're going to go along as we go. So if you've got your Bibles, it's going to be on the screen as well, but I'm going to start in verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. So essentially this is about the people in darkness. It's those in darkness who will see the light. And both of these stanzas essentially are saying the same thing. You only see light in darkness. That's when you notice light. The obvious example we have is stars, isn't it? When we look at the sky in the daylight, we can't see the stars. It's not simply that the stars have disappeared and they're not there. They're still there. But because of the sun's light, we can't see the light coming from the stars. But when the darkness comes, the stars, the light from the stars that stands out, it becomes noticeable. I remember this year on holiday, we went to Croatia for one of our holidays. And it was beautiful. And I remember sitting in the pitch black with my kids next to the pool, and they were remarking on how many stars they could see in the sky. And it's not that there's less stars in Liverpool. I don't think there is anyway, than in Croatia. But we're in a big city here. We have light streaming around from so many other different sources. But in rural Croatia, where we were, there was nothing around for miles. And the sky was just lit up beautifully with all these stars. It's the same as I think about fireworks night. Do you know, when we moved here, we converted our house and we converted the attic and made this huge window. And it is, honestly, I think one of the best spots that you can have on fireworks night is from our attic window. And it looks out, it's like this panoramic view over the whole of Liverpool. And we can see right across the city. But you know what? If we were to watch, and it's amazing, but if we were to watch these fireworks in the daytime, I'm sure we'd hear them still, but it wouldn't look the same. Isaiah is saying here as we enter this chapter, it's those in darkness who will see the light. I think about our context of what's happened over the last 3 years. We've been through some incredibly dark days as a planet. Going through this sort of COVID era. Now we have a war in Ukraine that is still quite far removed from us, but we're feeling a little bit of the impact, aren't we? And so I think sometimes when we read these passages, it's really hard to empathize. And I think about my life, and never been involved in a war, wasn't around in World War II. And so I think this is like the first time as I think about our culture that we have a little chance to empathize with this darkness that Isaiah is talking about for a nation. You know, we went through that COVID era with people, tens of thousands of people losing loved ones, not being able to say goodbye at a funeral. Extreme sickness, yet not being able to sit next to your loved ones and comfort them. And this extreme isolation. They're all things that we've experienced through these last few years. And as we wrestled with this COVID era, the talk of a COVID vaccine was used all the time. And this phrase, light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah? We heard it all the time coming from government. There's light at the end of the tunnel. This light was about the answer to the darkness, the answer to oppression, the answer to sickness and death. The light we're talking about here is about the Savior of the world. But you know, Isaiah in this passage isn't just talking about a physical reality, even though the nation of Israel is in a real physical struggle. He's talking about a spiritual reality as well. It's the people in darkness spiritually who see Jesus and are drawn to him. It's those who are broken, those who are battered, those who are suffering, those who are marginalized, oppressed. They need rescue. And they recognize that they need him. They recognize they need saving. It's not just those. Fundamentally, if we think about it spiritually, it's those who recognize the state of our own souls. We recognize we need to be saved from ourselves. Do you know, we're living, aren't we, I think in, I want to use the word unprecedented, that's used all the time. We're living in an age of unprecedented health issues around depression and mental health. We have a nation at the minute who seem to be struggling to find meaning, seem to be pretty directionless. Our future at present seems to be more precarious than ever. But when I think about this, the good news is that the light can shine in the darkness. The light can shine in darkness. Jesus came for this nation. He came for the nations of the world. He's come for those who feel alone, those who feel isolated, and those who are struggling. Secondly, what does this light bring? It says, you have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. So Isaiah has obviously introduced this idea to start with, that this king is going to be light in the darkness. But he's starting to look at some of the tangible elements of what we can experience with the coming of the king. So he explains that this king is going to enlarge the nation. Now remember, they're a small little nation. Tiny. He's going to enlarge it. It's going to be mass expansion. But he uses some pictures, I think here, that are actually quite hard for us to understand. But he's saying these things bring immense joy and celebration and rejoicing to the nation. And the two things he talks about here is a harvest and dividing plunder after a victorious battle. Don't know how many of us have been involved in divide and plunder at a battle. I can't imagine many of us, to be honest. If you have, come and chat to us later. But they are hard things for us to understand what this joy that they're talking about is saying. But if we think about it, if we try and get in their world, okay? We think about agriculture. Now, we have agriculture in this country, just there's not that many people involved in it. For many of us, I doubt we're involved in agriculture. But if you lived in this era, in this time, in this nation, you'd spend months plowing and irrigating and waiting and praying for the rain to come and hoping that all your labor will bear fruit. Why? Because this is actually going to feed your family. This is actually a matter of life and death. And if your crops fail, if they're ruined, guess what? Your family dies. So you can imagine when the harvest comes, when it yields fruit, when actually you're able to feed your family, you're able to sell some of the crops and make money to feed your family. There was immense relief and celebration that was had. All of that hard work that you've spent getting up at the early hours is over. And there's this season of relief for now and celebration. And this other analogy of divide and plunder in the battle, You think about a battle. Obviously, I mentioned the Ukraine war, and we get a lot of media coverage on that. And so we're seeing pictures all the time of this battle. They've now been battling for, 10, 11 months now for their own nation. And I think we're getting some kind of idea of what it's like, but you can imagine being on the battlefield here as nations. It's physically demanding. It's mentally and emotionally demanding. Fighting for years on end often to see victory. Losing friends and family. But as this footage came out in Ukraine of them taking back territory in Kherson, what do we see? Celebration. We saw it on the news, we saw it in videos as they celebrated the victory of actually just retaking what was theirs. Immense celebration. And yet for these guys, the war's not over. They continue to fight. But there's small celebrations. I imagine when this war does come to an end, there's going to be a major party and celebration where they can put down their weapons, their swords, or tanks. But there'll be immense relief and celebration. Now, these are just pictures to help us to understand what will happen when this child is born. When the light breaks in, it's going to be such joy and relief. Unfortunately, they're still quite removed from our culture, these pictures, aren't they? I was thinking, actually, as we think about this COVID era, it's really helpful for us to understand this passage and experience it. Because this is an example that we've all lived through. We all understand what it's like to have an uncertain future. We've understood what it's like to be eagerly awaiting for a vaccine that is going to stop deaths. It's going to bring freedom again to socialize, to eat out, to go to places of education and workplaces, to start that normality of life that maybe we've taken for granted. And you know what? It took everyone, didn't it? It wasn't just our health service who were amazing. It wasn't just our teachers or public workers, but everyone had to play their part in isolating or looking after neighbors or relatives. But when the vaccine came, when the news came that we found something that is going to work, man, we've all experienced that. What was it like for you? Back to normality. There was relief, wasn't there? There was that celebration of, I can see them again. So joy unspeakable will break in. Light is going to bring a new joy to us. Next, peace. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boots used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning with fuel for the fire. This is the image of a slave master's tools or weapons that are being used by the oppressors being shattered and smashed. The oppressor's tactics and tools will be done away with. When this child is born, he will take the oppressive regime that we have been under. And verse 5 seems to suggest that there's going to be a massive bonfire of boots and military clothing. So what we're going to do is we're going to essentially gather all of the weapons and the clothing that have been used in battle, and we're going to pour petrol or paraffin over it and set it alight. Why? What's he saying? Essentially, he's saying these items are no longer going to be needed. There will not be any what if the enemy attacks later. No. It will be done. There'll be a peace that will come that will be definite. And it's going to give us confidence to burn it all. Not like in our earthly tactics right now, You hear all of our governments talking about having to raise our money for defense by this many GDP. We want to store up weapons because of the threat that's there. This is a peace that this king is going to bring like no other. And it says it'll be like the day of Midian. You see that? And the mention of Midian for this nation would have immediately evoked a story in the heads of Israelites. And that is of Gideon attacking the Midianites. Now, if you don't know, Gideon was this fairly timid guy. He was found in a wine press, hiding away from his oppressors. And God got hold of him, and he declared that he was going to make him a mighty warrior of Israel. And God called him to go and defeat the Midianite army. That was made up of tens of thousands of warriors. And so Gideon gathered 32,000 men together as his army. And then God had other plans, didn't he? If you know the story. He said to Gideon, no. You've got the wrong idea here. I know you've gathered this huge army, but I want to cut this army down. I want to cut it down to just 1% that you have. Every 99 of those 100 men, I want you to send home. Why? Because God wanted his people to see that it was his power that will win the victory. Not by man's strength. Oh, and by the way, and I want you to cut this army down to 1%. But I also don't want you to fight with swords and shields either. God's not gathering some kind of Spartan army who is this mega force, giving them some sort of superpower there. He says, I want you to fight this battle by forming a ring around their camp. And I want you to bring with you a jar with a light in and a trumpet. And I want you to smash your lights and blow your trumpets and shout out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. What? Could you imagine? Really? You want me to go into this enemy who has been oppressing us for years with no weapons, with the tiniest group of men? But you know what? He does it, doesn't he? He has faith to trust God that he can do this. And so he does exactly what God has told him to do. And what happens? They smash their lights, they blow their trumpets, and the whole of their army gets thrown into utter confusion. And this Midianite army ends up killing themselves, attacking themselves. And God, through Isaiah, is saying that this story is what is going to happen. It's what it's going to be like when this child, this light of the world, is born into the world. When this light breaks in. You have a world filled with war and turbulence, and God will act, and the darkness will destroy itself. He will confuse and frustrate and conquer. And we know the story, don't we? The cross of Christ. The enemy thought he was defeating God by crucifying Jesus. But he was actually bringing his own downfall about. The enemy thought he was winning. But it was God's plan for his own victory. And we're going to be standing there, folks, having done nothing. We'll not be able to take any credit, okay, for the victory. Just as Gideon's army could take no credit for their victory. Could you imagine? Can you imagine them trying to take credit for their victory? Man, did you hear how loud I blew that horn? Just threw them into utter confusion. I've been practicing away. It's crazy. There's no chance that any of that army could take any of the claim for that victory. It was all God's doing, without question. And you know, Jesus, this new light, he will defeat the darkness and peace will reign. The battle will be over and we'll be able to put down our weapons because of the peace that he brings. Finally, and these are the verses that most people would preach on at Christmas time, this new king, okay, just describing who he is. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. Do you know, if you weren't amazed at the beginning of this prophecy so far, just look at that. In the context of what we know, this section is truly remarkable. And it unquestionably speaks of Jesus Christ. It's 700 years, remember, before he was even born. I'm not even sure Isaiah knew when he penned this what he was truly speaking about, to be honest. But even in these first two lines, we get to recognize the divinity of this child. To think that this child is not just a child that has to be born, but he's been given. Yeah, do you recognize that? He's been given. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. And as we look at these, just a few of these names very quickly to end, we're going to realize that there is no other option of who Isaiah is speaking about. It is Jesus Christ. And each of these names that we're going to see uses a sense of the divinity and the humanity that we're going to find in Jesus, the God-man. And he goes on to describe how he will be like a ruler like no other king or the world has ever seen before. This is the king that is coming. So he called the promised child Wonderful Counselor. Okay, that's one of the first names he uses. And do you know, a king often had a council, don't they? They have a team of people who they can go to for counsel to help them in advising them around decision making. Happened then, still happens today. Prince Charles will have a team of advisories who will advise him on all sorts of issues. But this king who will reign will be the Wonderful Counselor. And he'll be able to guide us with his perfect wisdom and knowledge. He doesn't need to go anywhere for counsel. He's all-knowing. He has amazing wisdom and knowledge. And in fact, he's going to go further because he's going to take up all of our problems on himself and carry them for us. In our anguish, in our difficulties, in our struggles, he will be the Wonderful Counselor that we can go to. Mighty God. This name speaks of the heroic exploits that this king, this new king, is going to live out. And when mighty was often used in the Old Testament times, it was describing that great works done by Moses or Joshua or King David. But Isaiah is describing this king as a hero who is far more than Moses or Joshua or David. He's calling him a divine hero, a God who does heroic acts. We know, don't we, that he is the king who will live out and perform actually the most heroic act that the earth has ever seen. This is the king who comes. It's Jesus. He's going to die for those who were his enemies, those who rejected him, and those who have been living for self. This mighty King, Jesus, everlasting Father. This child will not come into existence when he is born. He is everlasting. No ending, no beginning. He's the Alpha and Omega. Could Isaiah say any more plainly that this child is God incarnate? God becomes a child. And this idea of this Father speaks of his compassion, his loving care, his protection, his guidance and support, and his encouragement that fatherhood brings to us. He's also the Prince of Peace. And this is because his kingdom will be one of peace. Okay? It won't be a kingdom in constant flux or major volatility where the people of the kingdom don't know whether it's here today or gone tomorrow. Remember, that's what this nation is facing. Total flux. They don't know whether they're going to survive or be crushed by one of the superpowers. But this kingdom that this king is bringing is a kingdom of peace. And peace will reign because he will have dealt with the ultimate enemy, Satan. And he's conquered sin and death once and for all time. The king is the guarantee that his joy and his peace isn't just a flash in the pan. It actually says of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. This peace and joy and righteousness and justice that Isaiah speaks of is to be an everlasting kingdom ruled by this King Jesus. The turmoil, the anguish, the suffering, the isolation, the uncertainty that these Israelites were facing, that would have led to such anticipation as Isaiah spoke about who this king was and what he was going to bring. There would have been a longing for this king to come. Send him, the rescuer. And so here at Christmas, we too need to be reminded of this anticipation of this long-awaited ruler who would rule so differently to any other king before him. It's the ruler king, Jesus. It's why we don't have to live in fear or turmoil or anguish and pain, because he's brought a new kingdom era. He's defeated the enemy of death and destruction so that we get to have a hope and a future, an eternity where Revelation 21 verse 4 says, there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. This is the king, the kingdom that this new king is bringing. This joy and this peace isn't limited to one generation. It's not limited to a battle in one time. This joy and peace that he will bring through his victory is one unlike any other brought before. Different to all other battles, because he has defeated death once and for all time. His joy and his peace is eternal. Isaiah's prophecy here, as we look at it, it's remarkable, isn't it? Yeah? It should make us want to celebrate and rejoice that the light of the world has come into the darkness and he's brought for us this new joy, this new peace, this promise of the new King Jesus, who's going to reign forever and ever.